Robert Blake's story is one of the most unsettling in Hollywood history, a tale of a once celebrated actor whose career and legacy collapsed under the weight of scandal and a crime that shocked the entertainment world. Known for his roles in Cold Blood and the 1970s television series Beretta, Blake was praised for his talent and intensity on screen. But off-screen, his personal life was chaotic, and in the early 2000s, he would be accused of one of the most infamous crimes to ever involve a Hollywood figure, the murder of his wife, Bonnie Lee Bakley. Blake was born Michael James Gubitosi in 1933 in Nutley, New Jersey, and began his career as a child actor in the Our Gang series before transitioning to adult roles. His career spanned decades, with standout performances that earned him critical acclaim and a reputation as a serious, method-driven performer. By the 1990s, though, Blake's career had slowed, and his public image was defined less by his work and more by his volatile personality and tumultuous private life. In 1999, Blake met Bonnie Lee Bakley, a woman with a reputation of her own. Bakley was notorious for her relationships with wealthy and famous men, often accused of pursuing them for money and security. She had a complicated personal history, including multiple marriages and children from different relationships. Her relationship with Blake was stormy from the beginning, but in 2000, when Bakley gave birth to a daughter, DNA testing confirmed Blake was the father. Reluctantly, Blake married her, though those close to him described the union as deeply troubled, marked by resentment and mistrust. On May 4, 2001, tragedy struck. Blake and Bakley had dinner at Vitello's, an Italian restaurant in Studio City, California. Afterward, they returned to Blake's car, which was parked nearby. Blake claimed he had left his gun inside the restaurant and went back to retrieve it. When he returned to the car, Bakley had been shot to death in the passenger seat. The bizarre circumstances immediately raised suspicion. How had someone managed to kill her in such a short window of time? And why had Blake conveniently left the scene at that exact moment? The investigation into Bakley's murder quickly centered on Blake himself. Prosecutors alleged that Blake had grown tired of his wife and sought to eliminate her, hiring others to do the job. Witnesses came forward claiming Blake had tried to solicit them to commit the murder, though these accounts were challenged for credibility. Still, the circumstantial evidence painted a damning picture: a strained marriage, financial motives, and a crime that seemed almost too convenient to be random. Blake was arrested in 2002 and charged with murder, along with conspiracy to commit murder and solicitation of murder. The trial began in 2004 and immediately drew intense media attention. It was Hollywood theater in the truest sense, with a former star now the accused in a real-life murder mystery. The prosecution leaned heavily on witness testimony, particularly accounts of Blake seeking out hitmen. The defense, however, attacked the reliability of these witnesses and argued that there was no physical evidence tying Blake to the crime. Indeed, no gun was ever definitively linked to the shooting, and forensic evidence was inconclusive. In March 2005, after months of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: not guilty of murder. Blake was acquitted, a free man once more. Yet the victory was hollow. While he escaped criminal conviction, the civil trial that followed told a different story. In November 2005, a jury found Blake liable for Bakley's wrongful death, ordering him to pay $30 million in damages to her family, a sum later reduced but still financially devastating. The judgment effectively bankrupted him, stripping him of what remained of his fortune and forcing him into obscurity. After the trial, Blake's life spiraled further into decline. Once a respected actor, he became a pariah in Hollywood, unable to find work and living on the margins. He gave sporadic interviews, often bitter and defiant, insisting on his innocence, but acknowledging his life had been destroyed. The public, divided as always in such cases, viewed him with suspicion, unable to separate the verdict from the haunting circumstances of the crime. For many, the question lingered: if Blake hadn't killed Bakley, who had? Robert Blake's story is less about the bright flame of fame and more about the shadows that fame can hide. Here was a man who had everything: talent, acclaim, recognition, only to see it collapse under the weight of scandal and suspicion. Whether guilty or innocent in the eyes of history, his reputation never recovered. He died in 2023 at the age of 89, his legacy forever tied to a crime that will always haunt Hollywood lore. The reflection that remains is chilling. Fame does not insulate anyone from darkness. For Robert Blake, the tragedy of his wife's murder and the years spent defending himself in court ensured that his career would never be remembered for its artistic heights, but for its association with one of the most notorious Hollywood scandals of all time. The prison of public judgment, even without a formal conviction, was one he never escaped. Mark Wahlberg is now celebrated as a Hollywood leading man, a producer of blockbuster films and a businessman with global ventures. But his past hides a darker chapter, one that nearly derailed his life before his career ever began. Long before The Departed, Transformers, and Ted, Wahlberg's teenage years were marked by violence, drug use, and criminal behavior. At just 16, he was arrested and sentenced to prison for an attack that revealed the turbulent path he had walked before his fame. Born in 1971 in Boston, Massachusetts, Wahlberg was the youngest of 9 children in a working-class family. His early life was marked by poverty, instability, and trouble with the law. By his early teens, he was skipping school, abusing drugs like cocaine, and spending time with older friends involved in crime. Boston in the 1980s was a city rife with racial tension and gang activity, and Wahlberg became deeply entrenched in a lifestyle that revolved around petty theft, fights, and violence. Teachers and social workers saw him as a lost cause, and police officers knew his name well. By 13, Wahlberg was addicted to substances and had already dropped out of school. By 15, he had amassed a criminal record that included dozens of incidents ranging from harassment to assault. His reputation as a street tough was growing, but his actions escalated to a point that would change his life forever. In April 1988, at the age of 16, Wahlberg attacked 2 Vietnamese men during an attempted robbery. Armed with a wooden stick, he struck one man unconscious and left the other with permanent damage to his eye. Wahlberg was arrested shortly after, and prosecutors charged him with attempted murder, later reduced to assault and battery. The brutal nature of the attack, along with the racial undertones of his history — he had previously harassed black children with racial slurs and thrown rocks — painted a picture of a deeply troubled teen. Wahlberg pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, though he served only 45 days at the Deer Island House of Correction. For a teenager, even that short time behind bars was sobering. Prison exposed him to the harsh realities of what his future could look like if he continued down the same path. Wahlberg later admitted that the experience terrified him, forcing him to reflect on his actions and reconsider the trajectory of his life. He realized that if he didn't change, he would spend his adult years either behind bars or dead on the streets. Upon his release, Wahlberg attempted to turn his life around. His brother Donnie, already finding success as a member of the boy band New Kids on the Block, encouraged him to pursue music as an outlet. Mark reinvented himself as Marky Mark, fronting the group Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. Their 1991 hit Good Vibrations catapulted him into stardom, giving him a second chance few could have imagined when he was a teenager in prison. He transitioned to acting in the mid-1990s, earning critical acclaim for roles in films like Boogie Nights and gradually building a career that would transform him into one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. Still, Wahlberg's past has never fully disappeared. Over the years, critics and activists have pointed to his violent history, particularly the racially motivated nature of his crimes, as a stain on his redemption narrative. In 2014, Wahlberg made headlines again when he filed for a pardon for his 1988 assault conviction, sparking debate about accountability, privilege, and forgiveness. While some argued he had proven himself a changed man through decades of work and philanthropy, others saw the attempt as an effort to erase responsibility rather than atone for it. Ultimately, he withdrew the request, acknowledging that seeking a pardon reopened wounds for the victims and their communities. The haunting reflection in Wahlberg's story is how thin the line can be between ruin and redemption. At 16, he was a violent criminal on a trajectory toward a life defined by prison sentences and destruction. But through a combination of luck, talent, and support, he transformed himself into a global star. His prison stint, though brief, became the turning point that forced him to confront the reality of his actions. While his success is undeniable, the shadow of his past lingers, reminding us that the mistakes of youth, especially those born of hate and violence, can never fully be erased. For Wahlberg, the question is not whether he paid his debt to society in 1988, but whether true redemption can ever be granted when the scars left behind are permanent. His story sits uneasily between cautionary tale and inspiration. A man who rose from the streets of Boston to Hollywood stardom, but whose legacy will always include the days he spent in a cell, reflecting on the life he nearly destroyed before it began. Phil Spector was a legend in the music industry long before his name became synonymous with murder. As a producer, he revolutionized pop music in the 1960s with his wall of sound technique, shaping the sound of artists like the Ronettes, the Crystals, and the Righteous Brothers. He worked with the Beatles on their Let It Be album and became one of the most influential figures in modern music. Yet, behind the genius was a man plagued by instability, paranoia, and a volatile personality. Those darker traits culminated in a crime that shocked not just Hollywood, but the world. Spector was born in the Bronx in 1939, and after his father's suicide when he was a child, his family moved to Los Angeles. The trauma of that loss haunted him for life, feeding insecurities and erratic behavior that would surface again and again in his career. In his early 20s, Spector was already hailed as a prodigy, producing chart-topping hits and developing a reputation as a perfectionist who controlled every detail of a recording session. But while the world saw brilliance, those close to him often witnessed cruelty, manipulation, and a hair-trigger temper. As the years passed, stories of Spector's eccentricities grew darker. He was known to brandish guns in recording studios, intimidating artists and engineers. Friends and collaborators described him as unstable, capable of switching from charm to rage in an instant. His relationships with women in particular were marked by control and violence. Ronnie Spector, lead singer of the Ronettes, and his ex-wife, later described their marriage as a prison. She claimed he held her captive in their home, forbade her from leaving, and threatened her life. Though she eventually escaped, her stories painted a disturbing portrait of a man whose brilliance was inseparable from his darkness. On February 3, 2003, Spector's life took its final, irreversible turn. That night, he entertained actress Lana Clarkson, best known for her roles in the 1980s. After meeting her at the House of Blues in Los Angeles, Spector invited her to his mansion in Alhambra. Hours later, Clarkson was dead from a gunshot wound to the mouth, discovered slumped in a chair in Spector's foyer. Spector initially told his chauffeur, "I think I killed somebody," a statement that would haunt him throughout the investigation. Police arrested him that same night. From the beginning, Spector maintained that Clarkson's death was an accident, claiming she had killed herself. Prosecutors, however, argued otherwise, pointing to his long history of violent behavior with women and his obsession with firearms. Witnesses testified that Spector routinely threatened women with guns, often during moments of rage. Forensic evidence supported the prosecution's theory that Clarkson had not pulled the trigger herself. The case was clear. Spector's volatility had finally turned deadly. The first trial in 2007 ended in a hung jury, with jurors unable to agree on a verdict. But in 2009, during a retrial, the prosecution refined its case, presenting a chilling narrative of Spector as a man whose life of power, control, and paranoia had culminated in murder. The evidence, combined with testimony from women who described similar experiences of being threatened by him, painted a damning picture. This time, the jury convicted him of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison, effectively ending his life as a free man. Spector was sent to the California Substance Abuse Treatment Facility and State Prison, where he remained until his death in 2021 at the age of 81. In prison, the eccentric producer was rarely heard from, his once powerful presence reduced to that of another inmate serving out his days. The legacy he left behind is one of contradiction. Musical genius forever overshadowed by violence and murder. The reflection on Spector's downfall is haunting. He had shaped the soundtrack of an era, giving the world timeless music. Yet his personal demons consumed him. His obsession with control, his paranoia, and his violence made him dangerous to those closest to him, and ultimately led to the death of Lana Clarkson. The same relentless drive that fueled his artistry also destroyed his humanity. In the end, Spector's prison sentence became a symbol of justice, catching up with even the most powerful figures. His story is a reminder that brilliance does not excuse cruelty, and that fame cannot shield a man from the consequences of his violence. Wesley Snipes was once one of the most bankable action stars in Hollywood. Known for his charisma, martial arts skills, and commanding screen presence, he starred in a string of successful films in the 1990s, from White Men Can't Jump to Demolition Man, and perhaps most famously, the Blade trilogy, which helped pave the way for modern superhero movies. But behind the glamour and success, Snipes was making financial choices that would eventually land him not on the big screen, but behind prison bars. Born in Orlando, Florida, in 1962, Snipes discovered his passion for performance early. After training in martial arts and studying theater, he broke into film in the mid-1980s, quickly rising to fame. By the mid-1990s, he was a household name, celebrated for his versatility in both comedies and action films. Yet even at the height of his career, trouble was brewing. Snipes became entangled with individuals and organizations that promoted tax protester movements, groups that falsely claimed U.S. tax laws were illegitimate or optional. Whether out of misguided belief or sheer recklessness, Snipes began ignoring his tax obligations. Between 1999 and 2001, at the peak of his career earnings, Snipes failed to file federal income tax returns, despite earning millions. Prosecutors later claimed he attempted to hide his wealth through fraudulent means, including bogus refund claims totaling tens of millions of dollars. To the IRS, this wasn't just negligence, it was willful evasion. In 2006, after years of investigation, Snipes was indicted on charges of conspiracy to defraud the government, filing false claims, and failing to file tax returns. The trial began in 2008 in Ocala, Florida, and it immediately attracted national attention. The prosecution argued that Snipes had deliberately chosen to defy the law, influenced by tax protester theories that had no legal basis. The defense countered that Snipes had been misled by bad advisors and genuinely believed he was acting within his rights. While the jury acquitted him of the more serious felony charges, they convicted him on 3 misdemeanor counts of failing to file tax returns. For those convictions, Snipes was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. In December 2010, Snipes reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania to begin serving his sentence. For an actor who had once commanded the spotlight, prison life was a stark contrast. Inmates described him as reserved but respectful, keeping to himself and using the time to reflect and study. Despite the humiliation of his conviction, Snipes served his sentence without incident, eventually being released in 2013. The aftermath of his incarceration was challenging. Hollywood had moved on during his absence, and Snipes found it difficult to re-establish himself in an industry that had little patience for scandal. Still, he gradually returned to acting, appearing in projects like The Expendables 3 and smaller independent films. Though he never quite regained his former A-list status, he rebuilt a steady career, proving his resilience even after such a public fall. Snipes has since spoken cautiously about his prison experience, framing it as both a humbling and clarifying period in his life. He insists that he was unfairly targeted by the government, portraying himself as a victim of overzealous prosecution. Yet critics argue that his downfall was the result of arrogance, believing he was above the law even as the evidence mounted against him. The haunting reflection of Wesley Snipes' story is the reminder that even the wealthiest and most celebrated figures are not immune to the taxman. His rise and fall serve as a cautionary tale about pride, poor advice, and the consequences of ignoring responsibilities. For Snipes, prison stripped away the trappings of fame and fortune, leaving only the hard reality of accountability. While he managed to return to Hollywood, his years behind bars remain a defining chapter of his life, a stark contrast to the immortal vampire hunter he once played on screen. In the end, it wasn't a villain on the big screen that brought him down, but the very real weight of financial recklessness and the law that governs everyone, celebrity or not. Felicity Huffman was once the picture of Hollywood respectability. A respected actress known for her award-winning role on Desperate Housewives and her critically acclaimed performance in Transamerica, she had built a career defined by talent and acclaim rather than scandal. But in 2019, Huffman became one of the most prominent names in a nationwide college admissions scandal, a sweeping investigation that exposed how wealthy families manipulated the system to secure spots for their children at elite universities. For Huffman, the fall was swift and humiliating, leading to a conviction and a brief but unforgettable stint in prison. Huffman was born in 1962 in Bedford, New York, and trained at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Her career developed slowly, gaining recognition in the theater before breaking through in television and film. By the early 2000s, she was a household name thanks to Desperate Housewives, for which she won an Emmy, and her work in Transamerica earned her an Academy Award nomination. She was respected, admired, and married to fellow actor William H. Macy, with whom she had 2 daughters. To many, hers was the picture of a grounded, successful Hollywood life. But behind the scenes, Huffman faced the pressures familiar to many wealthy parents, ensuring her children's success in a highly competitive educational system. In 2019, federal investigators revealed Operation Varsity Blues, a probe that uncovered a vast network of wealthy parents, coaches, and consultants who had used bribery, fraud, and deception to secure college admissions for their children. Huffman was one of dozens of parents charged in the scandal. According to prosecutors, she paid $15,000 to have her daughter's SAT answers secretly corrected by a proctor, artificially inflating her score. The case became a media firestorm. Huffman, with her squeaky clean reputation, was cast as one of the scandal's most prominent faces. Unlike some defendants, she admitted her guilt almost immediately, issuing a public apology in which she expressed shame and regret. She stated that her actions came from insecurity and fear as a parent, not entitlement, but acknowledged that what she had done was wrong. Her decision to plead guilty distinguished her from others caught in the scandal, some of whom fought the charges, prolonging their legal battles. In September 2019, Huffman was sentenced to 14 days in federal prison, along with a $30,000 fine, 250 hours of community service, and 1 year of supervised release. She reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, the following month. Her time behind bars was short. She was released after 11 days for good behavior, but the experience was transformative. Prison life, even for less than 2 weeks, left its mark. Fellow inmates described her as polite, reserved, and clearly overwhelmed by the environment. For someone accustomed to Hollywood sets and red carpets, the cold reality of prison was a sobering reminder of how far she had fallen. The aftermath of her sentence was significant. Though her prison term was brief, her career took a serious hit. Projects she had been attached to were delayed or recast, and public opinion of her shifted dramatically. While some sympathized with her remorse and her willingness to accept responsibility, others saw her punishment as a symbol of privilege, a slap on the wrist compared to the harsh sentences faced by less wealthy offenders for lesser crimes. The scandal as a whole sparked national conversations about inequality in education, privilege, and the lengths parents would go to secure advantages for their children. In the years since, Huffman has worked cautiously to rebuild her career. She returned to acting with smaller roles and slowly began reintegrating into Hollywood. Yet the scandal will always be part of her legacy, a reminder that even those at the top of the industry are not immune to poor decisions and their consequences. The haunting reflection in Huffman's case lies in its ordinariness. Unlike violent crimes or dramatic scandals, hers was the crime of a parent terrified that her child might not succeed in a world of intense competition. But her decision to cheat undermined the integrity of a system already fraught with inequality, highlighting the advantage wealth can buy. Huffman's story is not just about a Hollywood actress in prison. It is about the pressures of parenting, the corruption of privilege, and the dangers of believing that rules apply only to others. For Felicity Huffman, those 11 days in prison were short, but the sentence she carries in the court of public opinion may last a lifetime. Lori Loughlin's story is one of the most striking examples of how quickly a beloved public image can unravel. Known for decades as the wholesome Aunt Becky on the family sitcom Full House, Loughlin built her career on playing characters who embodied kindness, integrity, and moral guidance. But in 2019, she became one of the most infamous figures in the nationwide college admissions scandal, a crime that revealed the extent to which wealth and privilege could manipulate systems meant to be fair. For Loughlin, the scandal didn't just lead to a conviction and prison sentence. It destroyed the very image she had spent her entire career cultivating. Loughlin was born in Queens, New York in 1964 and began modeling as a teenager before transitioning into acting. By the mid-1980s, she had become a recognizable face on television, and in 1988, she landed the role that would define her career, Rebecca Donaldson Katsopoulos, the caring and principled Aunt Becky on Full House. The series made her a household name, and even after it ended, she continued working steadily in television and film, often cast in similarly wholesome roles. Off-screen, she was admired for her seemingly stable marriage to fashion designer Massimo Giannulli and her devotion to their 2 daughters. But in March 2019, Laughlin and Giannulli were indicted as part of Operation Varsity Blues, the same investigation that ensnared Felicity Huffman. Prosecutors alleged that the couple had paid $500,000 in bribes to secure admission for their daughters into the University of Southern California. Specifically, the bribes were funneled to coaches to present the girls as rowing recruits, despite the fact that neither had ever competitively rowed. The elaborate scheme involved staged photos and false athletic profiles, a deception that, once uncovered, became a symbol of the scandal's brazenness. Unlike Huffman, who quickly admitted guilt, Laughlin initially fought the charges. Alongside Giannulli, she pleaded not guilty and attempted to frame the payments as legitimate donations rather than bribes. The legal battle dragged on for over a year, with public opinion turning sharply against her. The wholesome Aunt Becky persona clashed painfully with the image of a wealthy parent manipulating the system at the expense of less privileged students. Online, she became a target of ridicule, with memes and jokes highlighting the contrast between her on-screen values and her real-life actions. By 2020, the pressure mounted, and Laughlin reversed course. She and Giannulli pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges, with Laughlin admitting her role in the fraud. In August of that year, she was sentenced to 2 months in federal prison, along with a $150,000 fine, 100 hours of community service, and 2 years of supervised release. Giannulli received a harsher sentence of 5 months. Laughlin reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, the same facility where Huffman had served her time, and began her sentence in October 2020. For Laughlin, prison life was a stark contrast to the world she had known. Though her sentence was relatively short, she faced the same stripped-down existence as any other inmate. Uniforms, strict schedules, and the absence of luxury. She served her full 2 months and was released in December 2020. But while her time behind bars was brief, the damage to her reputation was long-lasting. The Hallmark Channel and Netflix severed ties with her, cutting her from projects she had been central to. For an actress whose career relied heavily on her wholesome image, the scandal was devastating. Since her release, Laughlin has worked cautiously to rebuild her life and career. She has taken on a few acting roles, including reprising her character in spin-offs of When Calls the Heart, but she has largely remained out of the spotlight. The public remains divided. Some see her punishment as adequate and believe she deserves a chance at redemption, while others view her as emblematic of privilege and entitlement, unwilling to forgive her deception. The reflection on Lori Loughlin's story is sobering. Unlike many Hollywood crime tales, hers was not about violence, addiction, or desperation. It was about privilege and fear. In her determination to give her children every advantage, she crossed legal and ethical lines, ultimately paying with her freedom and her career. The irony is that the very values she portrayed on screen, honesty, integrity, and fairness, were the ones she abandoned in real life. For millions of fans who grew up watching Aunt Becky as a moral compass, the betrayal was deeply personal. Laughlin's prison sentence may have lasted only 2 months, but her fall from grace remains one of the most dramatic in Hollywood history. Her story is a reminder that no amount of fame or money can shield a person from the consequences of dishonesty, and that the images we see on screen often hide far more complicated realities behind them. For Lori Loughlin, the haunting question lingers: was the price of protecting her children's future worth the cost of destroying her own? Wesley Snipes was once one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. With his martial arts prowess, magnetic screen presence, and breakout performances in films like New Jack City, White Men Can't Jump, and the Blade trilogy, he seemed unstoppable. But while Snipes was battling vampires on screen, off-screen he was fighting an enemy of his own making, the United States government. His spectacular fall from grace would end not with applause but with a prison sentence, a reminder that no amount of celebrity can shield someone from the consequences of tax evasion. Snipes was born in Orlando, Florida in 1962. He grew up in the Bronx and studied at the High School of Performing Arts before attending the State University of New York at Purchase. His early life was marked by discipline. He trained in martial arts from a young age, and by a sense of ambition that propelled him into acting. By the late 1980s, he was on the rise, appearing alongside legends like Michael Jackson in the iconic Bad music video, directed by Martin Scorsese. Hollywood quickly took notice. Through the 1990s, Snipes established himself as one of the top action stars of his generation. His ability to blend physicality with charisma set him apart in an era filled with muscle-bound action heroes. The Blade films in particular cemented his status, creating a loyal fan base and generating massive box office returns. To the outside world, Snipes had it all: wealth, fame, and the kind of cultural cachet actors dream of. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. The issue was taxes, or rather, Snipes' refusal to pay them. Beginning in the late 1990s, he became involved with a group that promoted a fringe theory known as the tax protester movement. This movement claimed that income taxes in the United States were unlawful and that citizens were not legally required to pay them. Snipes, despite his success and fortune, bought into this idea. Between 1999 and 2004, he failed to file federal income tax returns altogether, even as he earned tens of millions of dollars. The IRS estimated that Snipes owed more than $15 million in back taxes. For years, his celebrity shielded him. Few believed that someone so prominent could truly be evading taxes so blatantly. But the evidence mounted, and in 2006, Snipes was indicted on multiple counts of tax fraud, conspiracy, and willful failure to file returns. The trial that followed was a media spectacle. Prosecutors painted him as arrogant and willfully defiant, while Snipes and his defense team argued that he had been misled by bad advisors. The actor even tried to settle his debts by offering the IRS a check for several $million, but the gesture came too late. In 2008, the verdict was handed down. Snipes was acquitted of felony tax fraud, but convicted on 3 misdemeanor counts of willfully failing to file tax returns. The punishment shocked Hollywood: 3 years in federal prison. For a man who had played indestructible heroes, the reality of a prison sentence was devastating. In 2010, he reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in McKean, Pennsylvania, to begin serving his time. Life behind bars was a stark contrast to red carpets and movie sets. At McKean, Snipes lived among roughly 300 other inmates. Reports from the prison suggested that he kept a low profile, spending his time reading, writing, and practicing martial arts. Fellow inmates described him as disciplined and polite, someone who understood his place in the system and adapted accordingly. But make no mistake, the experience was humiliating. His wealth and status could not buy him freedom, nor could it erase the fact that he had fallen victim to his own hubris. During his incarceration, Snipes appealed his sentence, arguing that the punishment was excessive for the crime. The appeals went nowhere. He served the bulk of his 3-year sentence before being released in 2013. By then, Hollywood had largely moved on. Roles were scarce, and the actor who had once dominated the action genre now struggled to regain his footing in an industry that had little patience for scandal. Still, Snipes attempted a comeback. He appeared in The Expendables 3 alongside other aging action stars, and he continued to take roles in smaller films and television projects. But his career never fully returned to the heights it had once reached. The shadow of his conviction loomed large, a reminder that his downfall had been self-inflicted. He had earned millions and thrown it all away by refusing to comply with the most basic requirement of citizenship: paying taxes. The public's reaction to Snipes' prison term was mixed. Some saw it as a cautionary tale, proof that no one, not even a Hollywood star, is above the law. Others viewed it as overly harsh, pointing out that many wealthy individuals manipulate the system far more cleverly and escape punishment. But for Snipes, the lesson was personal. He once said that prison had given him time to reflect, to recenter himself. Whether that reflection translated into lasting change is debatable, but there was no denying that the experience had scarred him. The haunting takeaway is this: Wesley Snipes' imprisonment wasn't for violence, drugs, or the kinds of scandals that often sink celebrities. It was for something far more mundane, and in some ways more damning. He simply refused to pay his taxes, and in the end, it destroyed the career he had built so carefully. His story stands as a stark reminder that the trappings of success can vanish in an instant, not through dramatic betrayal or tragic accident, but through something as bureaucratic and unforgiving as the IRS. Mark Wahlberg's journey to Hollywood stardom is often framed as a redemption arc. A troubled youth who turned his life around to become a successful actor, producer, and businessman. But buried beneath that narrative is a darker chapter, one that many fans either don't know about or choose to forget. Long before he was a household name, Wahlberg was a teenager in Boston whose violent actions would land him in prison and leave scars on his victims that never fully healed. Born in 1971, Wahlberg was the youngest of 9 children in a working-class Irish-American family. His childhood was chaotic, defined by poverty, family dysfunction, and exposure to crime at an early age. By his early teens, Wahlberg had dropped out of school and gravitated toward the rougher corners of Boston's Dorchester neighborhood. Drugs, theft, and violence became routine. He was arrested repeatedly, accumulating a rap sheet that reflected a pattern of recklessness and aggression. But the most infamous incident occurred in 1988, when Wahlberg was just 16 years old. High on drugs and alcohol, he attacked 2 Vietnamese men in separate incidents on the same day. In one case, he approached a man named Thunk Lam outside a convenience store and struck him with a wooden stick, knocking him unconscious. Later, he punched another man, Hoa Trinh, in the eye, leaving him with lasting damage. Wahlberg hurled racial slurs during the attacks, making the assaults not only brutal, but racially charged. Police quickly arrested him, and the charges were serious: attempted murder. The court proceedings were a turning point. Wahlberg, still legally a minor, faced the prospect of significant prison time. The attempted murder charge was eventually reduced to criminal contempt, but he was convicted of felony assault. The judge sentenced him to 2 years in prison, though he ultimately served 45 days at the Deer Island House of Correction. For the teenage Wahlberg, it was a sobering experience. He later admitted that seeing hardened criminals in prison terrified him and made him reconsider the trajectory of his life. Inside, Wahlberg confronted the reality of incarceration head-on. Unlike the Hollywood roles he would later play, there was no glamour, no adrenaline-filled action, just confinement, regimentation, and the constant tension of being surrounded by dangerous men. The brief but harsh sentence was enough to shake him, though not to erase the damage he had already done. His victims, particularly Hoa Trinh, bore physical and emotional scars for life. Trinh has spoken about how Wahlberg never apologized directly and how the attack remained a source of trauma. Upon release, Wahlberg faced a crossroads. He could sink deeper into the cycle of crime, or he could attempt to rebuild himself. It was his older brother, Donnie Wahlberg of New Kids on the Block fame, who offered him a lifeline. Donnie helped Mark launch a career in music, first as the frontman of the hip-hop group Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. Their 1991 hit, Good Vibrations, made him a star, transforming his image from violent delinquent to heartthrob. From there, he transitioned into modeling, most famously as a Calvin Klein underwear model, and eventually acting. The narrative of Wahlberg's rise often glosses over his prison sentence, but it was a pivotal moment in his transformation. Hollywood, for its part, seemed willing to forget his past in light of his charisma and talent. By the late 1990s, he was starring in films like Boogie Nights and Three Kings, solidifying his reputation as a serious actor. Later, he would produce acclaimed series like Entourage and Boardwalk Empire, further entrenching himself as a Hollywood power player. Yet the ghosts of his past have never fully disappeared. In recent years, Wahlberg has faced renewed criticism for his teenage crimes, particularly the racially motivated assaults. In 2014, he filed a petition for a formal pardon from the state of Massachusetts, claiming that he had changed his life and wanted to use his story as an example of rehabilitation. The move sparked controversy. Critics argued that his success in Hollywood did not erase the pain of his victims, and many questioned whether someone of lesser fame would ever have the luxury of a pardon. Ultimately, Wahlberg dropped the request, acknowledging that his victims' voices mattered more than his own need for closure. Today, Wahlberg is one of Hollywood's highest-paid actors, a businessman with restaurant chains and fitness ventures, and a man who frequently emphasizes his Catholic faith and devotion to family. But the contrast between his public image and his violent past raises haunting questions. How do we reconcile the charm of the actor with the cruelty of the teenager? Does success and philanthropy truly atone for acts of hate and violence? The story of Mark Wahlberg's time in prison is not just about one man's redemption. It's about society's willingness to forgive, especially when the person seeking forgiveness is wealthy, famous, and charismatic. For his victims, forgiveness may not come so easily. The scars remain, a reminder that behind the Hollywood smile is a history written in blood and regret. Wahlberg may have moved on to a glittering career, but for those who remember, the echo of his prison sentence lingers in the background, a shadow that no amount of fame can fully erase.